He had wealth, power, and silence, but lived in constant battle with his own impulses. She arrived with a past shrouded in secrets and a desire impossible to contain. The first time he saw her bare, he ran toward what he feared the most: surrender. If you enjoy stories of love and romance, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. Alexander Harrison always knew that his coldness was both his greatest virtue and his condemnation. At 42, he commanded one of the largest biotechnology conglomerates in America, headquartered in the business heart of New York City, where the mirrored glass skyscrapers reflected not only the sunlight but also the distance he maintained from everything and everyone. His reputation was built on surgical precision. He hired the best, paid whatever was necessary, and discarded without hesitation anything or anyone that didn't serve his purposes. Employees feared his meetings. Business partners respected his brilliance. Women approached him attracted by his power, but soon discovered that behind those steel-colored eyes was only more steel. No one in New York knew the truth that Alexander carried like an invisible scar. 3 months earlier, his life had silently collapsed when Elizabeth Morgan, one of the most coveted heiresses of New York's elite, and his lover for 2 years, disappeared after a devastating argument in his Upper East Side apartment. The police filed the case as a suicide. The newspapers suppressed the scandal, but Alexander knew there was blood on his hands, even if he hadn't been the one who held the gun. The call came on a rainy March afternoon, when New York seemed too gray, even by its standards. It was the family lawyer, informing him about the inheritance he had received after the death of his mother, Margaret Harrison. The matriarch, Italian by birth but American by choice, had died alone in the old family property in rural Virginia, a century-old estate that Alexander hadn't visited in 15 years. Margaret had been an iron woman disguised in velvet, who raised her only son between etiquette lessons, silent punishments, and a love so controlling that it seemed more like an elegant prison. When Alexander decided to leave New York, it wasn't just to escape the whispering glances or the headlines that insinuated his guilt. It was because something inside him screamed that he needed to return to the origin of what had transformed him into the man he was. A man who wanted to control everything because he feared losing everything, including himself. The Willow Creek estate was 3 hours from Richmond, hidden among hills covered with deciduous forest and fields that were once prosperous. The dirt road snaked like an old wound in the landscape, and when Alexander finally spotted the wrought iron gate with the family crest, he felt his stomach contract. The property seemed abandoned by time, stone walls covered with wild ivy, gardens that had become small forests, and at the center of it all, the main house. A 2-story colonial mansion, with wide verandas supported by dark wooden columns, tall windows protected by peeling shutters, and architecture that blended European refinement with the sturdiness necessary to survive the southern climate. Alexander parked his German car in front of the stone staircase and sat there for long minutes, observing the facade that held so many memories. He remembered the summers of his childhood, when Margaret forced him to spend vacations at the estate, away from his New York friends and the life he really wanted to live. It was here that she practiced her rigorous education, where each mistake was punished with glacial silence and each achievement received only a nod of approval. It was in this house that Alexander learned that love was something earned through perfection, and that vulnerability was a luxury that men like him couldn't afford. When he finally got out of the car, the silence of the countryside enveloped him like a suffocating embrace. Only the sound of birds and wind in the trees broke the oppressive quietude. The keys were with the caretaker, but Alexander knew where his mother hid the spare, under the 3rd step of the side veranda, in the same place for decades. His hands trembled slightly when touching the cold metal. The front door opened with a prolonged groan, as if the house itself was protesting against his presence. The internal air was heavy, loaded with dust and memories. Alexander walked slowly through the rooms, observing how everything remained exactly as he remembered. The rosewood furniture covered with white sheets, family portraits hanging on the walls like silent witnesses, the Steinway grand piano in the main hall, still polished and gleaming, as if Margaret had just finished playing. It was when he reached the study that he found the first surprise. On the mahogany desk, a sealed envelope with his name written in his mother's impeccable handwriting. Alexander hesitated before opening it, feeling that anything Margaret had left for him would be another lesson, another way to control him even after death. The letter was brief, typical of his mother. "Alexander, this house holds more secrets than you imagine. If you've decided to return, it's because you're finally ready to face who you really are. Don't trust anyone, especially women who come to you with sweet smiles and obscure intentions. Your mother, who loved you in her own way, Margaret." Alexander crumpled the paper between his fingers, feeling the familiar anger rise up his throat. Even dead, she managed to plant seeds of paranoia and distrust. He threw the letter into the unlit fireplace and walked to the window that overlooked the back of the property. The gardens that were once Margaret's pride were now a wild labyrinth of untamed roses and jasmine growing without direction. In the distance, he distinguished the silhouette of the old studio that his mother had built to receive artist friends who visited the estate during the 80s and 90s. Alexander never knew exactly what happened in that space. He remembered elegant women arriving from New York and Washington, D.C., always with heavy suitcases and mysterious glances. Margaret received them with a smile she never showed to her own son, and for days the estate would fill with low laughter, classical music, and whispered conversations that ceased whenever he approached. When he asked about the visits, he received only vague answers about therapeutic sessions and treatments for society ladies. The sound of tires on the gravel road interrupted his musings. Alexander frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone, and the caretaker would only come the following week. He walked to the front window and saw a modest car parking near the gate. A woman got out of the vehicle, and even from a distance Alexander felt something move in his chest. She wasn't exactly beautiful in the conventional sense, but there was a presence about her that demanded attention. Brown hair tied in a messy bun, simple but well-fitted clothes, and a posture that mixed delicacy with determination. She walked to the main door with firm steps, carrying a leather folder and what appeared to be a tool case. Alexander descended the stairs and opened the door before she even rang the bell. "Good afternoon," she said with a husky voice that sounded like whiskey and honey. "You must be Alexander Harrison. I'm Autumn Lane, art restorer and historic preservation specialist. I received a call from the law office about the restoration of the property." Alexander observed her in silence for a few seconds, trying to process the information. He hadn't requested any restoration service, but perhaps it was some determination from the will that he didn't yet know about. There was something in her eyes, dark as freshly roasted coffee, that disturbed and attracted him at the same time. "I wasn't expecting anyone," he finally responded, without moving away from the door. Autumn smiled, a subtle movement of her lips that didn't reach her eyes. "I imagine not. Your mother hired my services a few months before she passed away. I have the contract here if you want to verify." She extended some papers, and Alexander immediately recognized his mother's signature, typical of her, organizing his life even after death. He opened the folder and quickly read the contract. Services for sacred art restoration, conservation of antique furniture, and recovery of historical elements of the property. The amount was generous. "Paid in full up front. Come in," he said, stepping away from the door. Autumn passed by him, and Alexander caught a subtle perfume of vanilla and something floral he couldn't identify. She stopped in the entrance hall, observing the high walls and architectural details with the technical eye of someone who understood the subject. "It's a magnificent property," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "You can see it was built by someone who understood both beauty and durability." Alexander closed the door, and the noise echoed through the empty house. For some reason, her presence in that space loaded with memories caused him a strange sensation, as if two realities were dangerously meeting. Autumn walked through the house with an intimacy that left Alexander uncomfortable. It wasn't just the technical knowledge of someone who had studied colonial architecture, but something deeper, as if she already knew these rooms, as if each piece of furniture told her a familiar story. Her hands slid over surfaces with reverence, occasionally stopping to examine details most people would ignore. The mother-of-pearl inlaid in the hall table, the wear marks on the stair railing, the specific patina of the silver candlesticks. "Your mother had exceptional taste," she commented, stopping in front of a painting depicting a young woman at the piano. This painting? It's by Clara Lane, isn't it? An American artist who became famous in Europe in the 70s. Alexander frowned. He had known that painting since childhood, but had never paid attention to the signature in the lower corner. You know her work? Autumn hesitated for a fraction of a second, an almost imperceptible lapse. I've studied American art for years. Clara Lane had a brilliant but mysterious career. She disappeared from artistic circles in the late 80s and was never heard from again. There was something in the way she spoke about the artist that sounded too personal to be just academic knowledge. Alexander made a mental note but didn't comment. Instead, he led her through the main rooms, observing how she reacted to each environment. In the main hall, Autumn stopped in front of the Steinway piano and passed her fingers lightly over the keys. The sound echoed through the empty house, a fragmented melody that Alexander didn't recognize, but that made him remember nights from his childhood when Margaret played for illustrious visitors. Autumn closed her eyes for a moment, as if listening to something only she could perceive. "This piano has perfect acoustics," she murmured. "It was recently tuned. My mother insisted on keeping it in perfect condition, even though she played less and less in recent years," replied Alexander, approaching her. The proximity made him catch that subtle perfume again, and something primitive inside him reacted to the feminine presence in a space that had long been only his and his memories. Autumn moved away from the piano and opened her folder, removing a clipboard with detailed notes. "I need to make a complete inventory of items needing restoration. Your mother was very specific about certain pieces. She particularly mentioned some works on the second floor and in the studio." The mention of the studio made Alexander tense up. "That space has been closed for years. I don't think it's necessary to include it in the restoration." "Actually, it was one of her priorities," Autumn replied, consulting her notes. "There are pieces of considerable historical value in there, according to the inventory she provided me." Alexander observed her with renewed attention. There was too much determination in her voice for someone who was supposedly there just for work. "How exactly did you meet my mother?" Autumn raised her eyes from the notes, and for a moment Alexander saw something vulnerable in her expression before she recomposed her professional mask. "She sought me out through references. Apparently someone recommended my work." The answer was too vague, too evasive. Alexander felt the predatory instinct that had made him successful in business awaken. There was something Autumn wasn't telling, and that intrigued him as much as it irritated him. "Very well," he said finally. "You can start with the second floor. But the studio remains off-limits for now." Autumn nodded, but Alexander noticed a challenging gleam in her eyes. It was as if she already knew that she would eventually gain access to that space, regardless of his permission. She spent the rest of the afternoon cataloging pieces and taking photographs, always closely accompanied by Alexander, who discovered increasingly elaborate reasons not to leave her side. He told himself it was suspicion, that he needed to watch this woman who had appeared out of nowhere, with stories about contracts signed by his dead mother. But the truth was that something about her fascinated him, in a way he hadn't experienced in a long time. Autumn worked with intense concentration, taking detailed notes about each piece. But Alexander noticed that sometimes she would stop and simply observe the house as if looking for something specific. When he asked what she was doing, she always had a technical response ready, but her eyes told a different story. Late in the afternoon, while Alexander prepared coffee in the kitchen, Autumn disappeared. He found her in his mother's study, standing in front of a bookshelf with an expression of deep concentration. "Lost your way?" he asked, leaning on the doorframe. Autumn started slightly, as if caught doing something forbidden. "I'm sorry. I was admiring the book collection." Your mother had refined taste in literature. Alexander approached, observing that she was specifically looking at a section of books on art and music. She read a lot, especially about American artists who made careers in Europe. "Like Clara Lane," Autumn murmured almost to herself. "You really seem obsessed with this artist," observed Alexander, studying her profile. "Is there any specific reason?" Autumn turned to face him, and for the first time since she arrived, Alexander saw her defenses lower slightly. Every woman dedicated to art has her obsessions. Clara Lane represents something. a possibility of freedom that few women of her generation managed to achieve. The answer was too honest to be completely true. Alexander took another step in her direction, deliberately invading her personal space. Autumn didn't back away, but he saw her breathing accelerate slightly. "And you?" he asked, lowering his voice. "Have you achieved your freedom?" Autumn stared at him for long seconds, and Alexander felt an electric current crossing the space between them. There was challenge in those dark eyes, but also something that looked like hunger, a hunger that mirrored his own. "I'm still looking for it," she finally replied, her voice coming out huskier than intended. Alexander smiled, a predatory movement of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "Be careful not to get lost in the process." Autumn held his gaze, and Alexander realized he had found someone who wasn't easily intimidated. This excited him in a way he hadn't expected. "I don't scare easily, Mr. Harrison," she said, passing by him so close that their bodies almost touched. In fact, the more complex the challenge, the more interesting it becomes. Alexander stood still, feeling her perfume linger in the air, even after she left the study. For the first time in months, he felt truly alive. And for the first time in years, he felt afraid of what that might mean. Autumn didn't return the next day, as promised. Alexander spent the entire morning restless, walking through the house and getting annoyed with his own anxiety. Since when did the absence of an employee bother him? Since when did he allow a woman to occupy his thoughts in such an invasive way? He tried to work, calling New York to resolve company issues, but discovered his concentration was completely fragmented. It was only late in the afternoon that he heard the familiar sound of the car on the gravel road. Alexander was on the veranda, pretending to read reports, when Autumn appeared carrying more equipment. She wore a simple cotton dress that marked her silhouette without being provocative, but even so, Alexander felt his body react to the sight of her. "I apologize for my absence," she said, climbing the steps of the veranda. "I needed to get some specific materials in Richmond." "You don't owe me explanations," replied Alexander, maintaining a neutral tone. "This is your schedule." Autumn stopped in front of him, tilting her head slightly. "But I noticed you were irritated. It's written on your face." Alexander closed the document folder with more force than necessary. "I'm not that easy to read." "To me you are," she said simply, and there was an intimacy in the declaration that destabilized him. "You have a small vein that pulses in your left temple when you're annoyed, and you tighten your jaw in a specific way." The fact that she had observed him so attentively disturbed him more than it should have. Alexander stood up, standing too close to her, an intimidation tactic he used in business meetings. "You study me as if I were one of your restoration projects." Autumn didn't back down. Instead, she raised her face to look at him, and Alexander realized she was taller than she seemed, almost reaching his shoulders. "Perhaps you do need restoration," she murmured. "Some wounds are more visible than others." The observation hit something deep and painful inside him. Alexander grabbed her wrist, not forcefully but firmly enough to demonstrate control. "Be careful with your words, Autumn. You don't know me." Instead of being intimidated, she smiled, a slow and dangerous movement of her lips. "Not yet, but I intend to." Alexander abruptly released her wrist as if the contact burned. "Go to work, and keep your distance from matters that don't concern you." Autumn nodded, but her eyes shone with something that seemed like amusement. "As you wish, Mr. Harrison." She entered the house, and Alexander remained on the veranda for long minutes, trying to regain control over his own reactions. There was something deeply disturbing about her ability to disarm him so easily. When he entered, he found Autumn in the hall, organizing her materials near one of the walls where there were several smaller paintings. She had brought special gloves, solvents, and delicate brushes, and worked with the precision of a surgeon. "This painting has damage to the varnish layer," she explained without taking her eyes off the work. "But underneath, the original paint is surprisingly well preserved. Your mother took very good care of her collection." Alexander approached, observing the delicate movements of her hands. "She always said that art was the only thing that remained after everything else disappeared." "Your mother was a wise woman," Autumn commented, carefully applying a product to the canvas surface. "And she had good taste in choosing artists, especially American women." Again, the mention of American women artists. Alexander began to suspect it wasn't a coincidence. "You seem to have a special fixation on this theme." Autumn paused her work for a moment. Women artists have always faced unique challenges, especially when trying to build careers outside the country. Often they had to make impossible choices. What kind of choices? Between love and freedom, between safety and passion, between being accepted and being true to oneself. Autumn went back to work, but Alexander noticed tension in her shoulders. Clara Lane, for example. They say she had a great love in Europe, but chose to return to America when she discovered she was pregnant. Alexander felt something cold run down his spine. And what happened to her? She disappeared. Some say she died in childbirth. Others believe she raised her daughter in secret, away from artistic circles. Autumn raised her eyes to him, and Alexander saw a new intensity in her gaze. The son of the man she loved in Europe never knew he had a half-sister. The silence that followed was dense, loaded with implications Alexander didn't want to process. "Why are you telling me this?" Autumn went back to work, but her hands trembled slightly. Family stories are always interesting, don't you think? Especially when there are secrets involved. Alexander felt the world tilt slightly. "Autumn, who are you really?" She stopped working and faced him directly. For a moment, Alexander saw a raw vulnerability in her eyes, as if she were fighting against the urge to tell the whole truth. "I'm someone who's looking for answers," she said finally. "And you might have some of them." Before Alexander could respond, she stood up and walked to the window that looked out toward the studio. "Your mother told me there are important documents in there. Letters, photographs, things that could clarify certain questions about the family's past." "I already said that space is off-limits." Autumn turned to him, and this time there was no submission in her posture. "And I'm saying I need to get in there. It's part of the work I was hired for." "From what it seems, you were hired for much more than restoration," Alexander replied, approaching her again. "Want to tell me the real reason you're here?" Autumn took a deep breath, and Alexander saw that she was making a decision. "Your mother knew mine. They had a complicated relationship. I'm here because I need to understand what happened between them." "And you thought you could just show up at my house, pretend to be a restorer, and discover family secrets?" Alexander was close enough to see the small golden freckles on her skin, to feel the heat emanating from her body. "It's not working very well, is it?" Autumn admitted with a sad smile. "You're more perceptive than I expected." Alexander held her chin, forcing her to maintain eye contact. "I'm many things you didn't expect. The question is, are you prepared to discover which?" Autumn didn't try to pull away. Instead, she covered his hand with hers, keeping it against her face. "Perhaps the real question is whether you're prepared to discover who I really am." Alexander felt the air between them electrify. Something dangerous was happening, something that went far beyond physical attraction. There was recognition, as if two parts of a complex puzzle were finally fitting together. "Then tell me," he murmured, bringing his face closer to hers. "Who is Autumn Lane?" She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, Alexander saw in them a fierce determination. "I'm Clara Lane's daughter. And if my suspicions are correct, we are half-siblings, Alexander." The world stopped. Alexander released her face as if he had received a shock, backing up several steps. "What did you say?" Autumn stood firm, even with tears beginning to form in her eyes. "My mother told me before she died about the man she loved in Italy, about the son he already had, about how she had to choose between staying with him and protecting the daughter she was expecting." Alexander felt his legs weaken. He sat heavily in the nearest armchair, trying to process the information. "That's impossible. My real name is Autumn Lane Harrison," she continued, her voice breaking. "And I came here looking for a brother, not for—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but they both knew what she didn't say. Alexander looked at her as if seeing a ghost. And perhaps he was. A ghost from the past that had come to collect secrets he didn't even know existed. Alexander remained silent for long minutes, staring fixedly at Autumn as if she were a mirage that might disappear if he blinked. His mind frantically processed each interaction they'd had, each moment of attraction, each second in which he had wanted to touch her, possess her. The disgust with himself began to mix with a desperate denial. "You're lying," he finally said, his voice coming out hoarse and dangerous. "This is some kind of scam, some pathetic attempt to—" "To what, Alexander?" Autumn interrupted, and there was genuine pain in her voice. "To get what exactly?" "Access to your fortune, your property." She laughed bitterly. I didn't know you existed until 6 months ago, when my mother finally told me the truth before she died. Alexander got up abruptly, starting to pace back and forth like a caged animal. Even if it were true, even if my father had... That doesn't explain how you got the contract with my mother. How you knew so much about this house. Autumn dried her tears with the back of her hand, trying to regain her professional composure. Your mother contacted me, Alexander. Not the other way around. She discovered my existence somehow, and contacted me 3 weeks before she died. She said there were things I needed to know, secrets she had kept for decades. Margaret would never do that, Alexander replied, but his voice sounded less convinced. She was obsessed with protecting the family's reputation. She was dying, Autumn said softly. Maybe she felt remorse. Maybe she wanted to do the right thing at least once. Alexander stopped pacing and faced her. And what exactly did she say you needed to know? Autumn hesitated as if deciding how much to reveal. That my mother didn't choose to leave your father, that she was forced to leave, and that there's evidence of this in the studio. The mention of the studio made Alexander tense again. What kind of evidence? Letters, photographs, documents that your mother kept all these years. Autumn took a step in his direction. Alexander, she told me your father truly loved my mother, that the pregnancy wasn't a scandal to him, but to your family, especially to Margaret. Alexander felt a pang of something he couldn't identify. Perhaps it was relief, perhaps it was anger. My father never mentioned any Clara Lane, because he was forbidden from talking about her. Your mother made sure of that. Autumn was close enough now that Alexander could see the tears she was trying to hold back. My mother told me that Margaret threatened to destroy her career in Europe if she didn't completely disappear. Clara was 5 months pregnant when she returned to America. Alexander closed his eyes, trying to process the implications. If it were true, it meant that Margaret had been even more controlling and manipulative than he had imagined. It also meant that he and Autumn... No, he said, opening his eyes and meeting hers. Even if all this is true, it doesn't explain what's happening between us. Siblings don't feel this. Autumn blushed, but didn't look away. We are not blood siblings raised together, Alexander. We grew up without knowing of each other's existence. It's different. It's wrong, he said, but his voice didn't carry the conviction he would have liked. I know, Autumn murmured. Believe me, I know, but that doesn't make it less real. Alexander approached her again, as if drawn by a magnetic force he couldn't control. You came here knowing who I was, knowing you might be attracted to me. I came here hoping to find a brother, she corrected, but her breathing was accelerated by his proximity. Someone who could tell me about our father, about the family I never had. And instead you found this, Alexander murmured, raising his hand to touch her face but stopping inches from her skin. Autumn closed her eyes. Instead I found you. Alexander let his hand fall, backing away as if he had been burned. I need proof. I need to know if this is true before we do something irreversible, Autumn completed, opening her eyes. Alexander nodded. The studio. If there are answers on this property, that's where they'll be. Autumn took a deep breath. Your mother told me there was a key hidden in her study, behind a specific portrait. They walked in silence to the study, the tension between them now charged with a different energy, not just attraction, but also fear of what they might discover. Alexander stopped in front of the wall where several family portraits were hung. Which one? He asked. Autumn pointed to a smaller photograph, almost hidden between 2 larger portraits. It was an image of an elegant, middle-aged man, seated at the piano. Alexander recognized him immediately. It was his father, Joseph Harrison, photographed a few years before his death. Alexander carefully removed the picture from the wall. Behind it, there was a small golden key taped in place. His hands trembled slightly as he took it. She really left this here, he murmured more to himself. Your mother wanted the truth to be discovered, Autumn said softly. Maybe she felt guilty about what she did. Alexander pocketed the key and replaced the portrait on the wall. Let's go to the studio. But Autumn, he turned to face her, if we discover that you're right, if we discover that we really are half-siblings, this ends here. Whatever is happening between us ends. Autumn nodded, but Alexander saw pain in her eyes. And if we discover we're not related? Alexander hesitated. Then we'll have other questions to resolve. They left the house toward the studio, walking along the trail covered with vegetation that led to the small, isolated building at the back of the property. The sun was setting, tinting everything gold, and there was something almost ritualistic about their silent walk. The studio was an octagonal construction, with large glass windows that had once been clear but were now opaque from time and neglect. Vines had covered part of the walls, giving the place an abandoned and melancholic air. Alexander inserted the key in the old lock, which resisted for a few seconds before yielding with a metallic click. The door opened with a prolonged groan, releasing stale air that smelled of mold, old paint, and something indefinable that could have been a woman's perfume. Alexander found a switch on the wall, and to his surprise the lights worked, illuminating a space that seemed frozen in time. The studio was larger than it appeared from outside, with high ceilings and walls covered by dozens of paintings in different stages of completion. There were easels scattered throughout the space, dried paint palettes, brushes in glass jars, and in the center of the environment, a piano smaller than the one in the main house, but equally well preserved. Autumn walked slowly through the space, delicately touching surfaces as if she were in a sacred temple. "It's exactly as my mother described," she murmured. "She said this was the place where she felt most free." Alexander observed the paintings on the walls. Many were landscapes of the region, others portrayed women in natural poses, some nude, others wearing simple clothes. The style was distinctly American, with vibrant colors and a sensuality that seemed to emanate from the canvases themselves. "Are these works by Clara Lane?" he asked. Autumn nodded, tears beginning to stream down her face. She painted all this here. During the month she spent on this property, she stopped in front of a larger canvas, which portrayed a pregnant woman seated at the piano, her face turned toward an open window. "This is me," she whispered. "She painted me before I was even born." Alexander approached the painting and felt his world shatter a little more. The woman in the painting had the same dark eyes as Autumn, the same brown hair, the same elegant posture, and in the lower corner the signature, "Clara Lane, 1994, for my daughter Autumn, who will be born free." "God," murmured Alexander. "It's true. It's really true." Alexander remained standing in front of the painting for long minutes, absorbing the reality that was unfolding before him. Autumn was real. Her story was true. And that meant that everything he had felt for her since the moment he opened the door of his house was fundamentally wrong. Autumn moved away from him, walking to a table covered by a white sheet in the corner of the studio. With trembling hands, she removed the fabric, revealing piles of letters yellowed by time, photographs, and a journal bound in brown leather. "Your mother said I would find everything here, all the correspondence between her and Clara." Alexander approached reluctantly, as if the documents might bite him. Autumn opened one of the letters, and even from a distance he recognized Margaret's elegant handwriting. Her voice trembled slightly as she began to read aloud. "Clara, you need to understand that this situation is unsustainable. Joseph already has responsibilities here in America, and you're deluding yourself if you think he'll abandon everything for a romantic adventure. The child you're expecting cannot bear the Harrison name. It would be a scandal that would destroy not only our family, but also your career. I'm being generous in offering financial assistance so you can raise the child elsewhere, away from complications." Autumn stopped reading, tears flowing freely now. "She bought her, Alexander. Your mother literally bought my mother's silence." Alexander picked up another letter, this with a more delicate handwriting that must have been Clara's. His hands trembled as he read silently, processing words of desperate love directed to his father. Pleas for Joseph not to allow Margaret to separate them, promises that she would raise their daughter with pride, regardless of the circumstances. "Did my father know?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Did he know about you?" Autumn picked up a photograph from the pile and handed it to him. It was a black and white image of Joseph Harrison, embracing a young and visibly pregnant woman. Both were smiling, and there was a tenderness in the man's gaze that Alexander had never seen before. On the back of the photo, a dedication in his father's handwriting, "To Clara and our daughter Autumn. I will always love you both, Joseph." Alexander felt the world spin around him. He knew. He knew and did nothing to prevent you from being separated. "Maybe he tried," Autumn suggested softly. Maybe your mother was more persuasive than we imagine. Alexander picked up the leather journal and opened it to a random page. Margaret's handwriting covered the pages with detailed notes about therapeutic sessions with special clients. As he read, Alexander felt nausea growing in his stomach. His mother meticulously documented meetings with young women from high society, describing techniques of psychological conditioning and submission therapy that sounded more like psychological torture disguised as treatment. My God, he murmured. What was she doing here? Autumn took the journal from his hands and leafed through a few pages. She ran a kind of clandestine clinic. She promised to cure behavioral deviations in daughters of the elite. Depression, rebelliousness, promiscuous tendencies. Parents paid fortunes for her to correct their daughters. Alexander observed the studio again with new eyes. The easels, the canvases, the piano, all of it was scenery. An elaborate facade to hide much darker activities. And Clara? She discovered what was happening, Autumn answered, continuing to read. There's an entry here about how your mother tried to apply the same methods to Clara, using the pregnancy as leverage for psychological control. Alexander sank into a nearby chair, feeling the weight of the discoveries. My mother was a monster. Autumn approached him, hesitating for a moment before placing her hand on his shoulder. The touch sent an electric current through his body, and Alexander hated himself for still reacting to her presence, even after everything they had discovered. Alexander, she said softly, you aren't responsible for her actions. He raised his face to look at her and saw compassion in her dark eyes. But I am responsible for what I feel for you, and that's wrong in every possible way. Autumn removed her hand from his shoulder, as if she had been burned. I know, believe me, I know. But we can't choose who we fall in love with. Don't fall in love with me, Alexander said abruptly, standing up. Whatever you think you feel, it isn't real. It's just what? Autumn interrupted him, with a dangerous gleam in her eyes. Just two people who grew up separately, who met as strangers and felt attracted to each other. Just a man and a woman who share a blood tie they never knew existed? Alexander approached her, deliberately invading her personal space. It's incest, Autumn, no matter how you try to romanticize it. Technically it is, she agreed, not backing down, but emotionally. Physically, we didn't grow up together. We don't have shared childhood memories. There's nothing in our bodies or minds that recognizes us as siblings. Alexander held her shoulders, intending to push her away, but instead found himself pulling her closer. That doesn't make it right. And that doesn't make it less real, Autumn replied, placing her hands on his chest. Look into my eyes and tell me you feel nothing. Alexander stared at her, trying to find coldness, trying to invoke the ruthless executive he had always been. Instead, he found himself lost in the intensity of her gaze, in the way her lips were slightly parted, in the delicate curve of her neck. Autumn, he murmured, a warning and a plea at the same time. She leaned in closer, until Alexander could feel her breath against his skin. Tell me you don't want me. Alexander closed his eyes, fighting against all his body's impulses. I can't. Can't tell me that or can't not want me. He opened his eyes and found her studying his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed. Both, he finally admitted. Autumn smiled sadly. Then we are equally lost. Alexander released her shoulders and moved away, running his hands through his hair in frustration. I need to get out of here. I need to think. Alexander, Autumn called out to him as he headed toward the door. What are we going to do? He stopped, but didn't turn around. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. When Alexander left the studio, he left Autumn alone with the evidence of a truth that neither of them had asked to discover. She continued exploring the documents, finding more photographs of her mother, more letters that documented not only the forbidden romance, but also the cruel tactics that Margaret had used to separate them. In a smaller box, Autumn found something that made her blood freeze, photographs of other young women, clearly in states of psychological distress, some nude, others in submissive poses. And among the photos, a document that appeared to be a list of names, daughters of politicians, businessmen, judges, all treated by Margaret Harrison. Autumn realized that she had stumbled upon something much bigger and more dangerous than a simple forbidden romance. She had discovered evidence of an abuse network that could destroy careers, ruin families, and exposed decades of corruption in the highest spheres of American society. And at the center of it all, she and Alexander, two half-siblings fighting against an attraction that could destroy them as much as the truths they had just discovered. When Autumn finally left the studio, it was already dark. She found Alexander on the house's veranda, smoking a cigarette with hands that still trembled slightly. They looked at each other across the darkness, two shipwrecked, souls in the same stormy sea, knowing they had only each other to cling to, but that doing so could mean sinking together. They spent 2 days avoiding each other in the vastness of the property. Alexander locked himself in the study, immersing himself in work as he always did when reality became unbearable. Autumn continued cataloguing the discoveries from the studio, meticulously organizing the evidence as if it were possible to bring order to the emotional chaos that had settled between them. On the morning of the 3rd day, Autumn found Alexander in the kitchen, preparing coffee with mechanical movements. He had his back to her, but his shoulders tensed when he heard her steps on the cold stone floor. "We need to talk," she said, maintaining a respectful distance. Alexander didn't turn around. "About what?" "About how we're going to pretend none of this ever happened." "About what we're going to do with the evidence we found." Autumn pulled out a chair and sat at the massive wooden table. "Alexander, your mother wasn't just psychologically abusing young women. She was documenting everything. And some of the names on that list, they're people who are still in positions of power." Alexander finally turned around, and Autumn saw that he hadn't slept well. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his stubble gave him a dangerous air. "And what do you suggest? That we expose everything? That we destroy entire families for crimes committed decades ago?" "I suggest we think about the women who were victims," Autumn replied firmly. "Some of them may still be alive. They may still be suffering the consequences of what your mother did." Alexander served 2 cups of coffee and placed one in front of her, carefully avoiding any physical contact. "And you? Are you willing to expose yourself too? Because the moment we make this public, your existence will come to light, our family relationship will come to light." Autumn picked up the cup with hands that trembled slightly. "I don't care about that." "You should care. The American press won't be kind to the illegitimate daughter who appeared to claim an inheritance." "I don't want any inheritance," Autumn said abruptly. "I want justice." Alexander leaned against the kitchen counter, studying her face. "And me? What do you want from me?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with multiple meanings. Autumn took a sip of coffee, buying time to choose the right words. "I want you to help me do the right thing. And I want—" She stopped, fighting against the words that wanted to come out. "I want us to stop pretending we don't feel what we feel." Alexander slammed his cup on the counter with enough force that the liquid splashed. "We can't feel anything, Autumn. It's wrong in every possible way." "Wrong according to whom?" She stood up, approaching him despite the instinct that screamed to maintain distance. "According to society's rules? The same rules that allowed your mother to torture young women without consequences?" Alexander stared at her, and Autumn saw something wild shining in his eyes. "Don't confuse the two things. I'm not confusing anything. I'm saying that some rules exist to control, not to protect." She was close enough now to feel the heat emanating from his body. "I'm saying that maybe it's time we decided for ourselves what's right and wrong." Alexander held her wrists, but this time he wasn't gentle. His grip was firm, possessive, and Autumn felt a wave of heat run through her body. "You don't know what you're asking for." "I know exactly what I'm asking for," she replied, holding his gaze. "I'm asking you to stop running from what you feel for me." Alexander pulled her closer, until their bodies were almost touching. "And if what I feel for you is dangerous? What if I'm more like my mother than you imagine?" Autumn saw something dark in his eyes, something that should frighten her but instead excited her in a primitive way. "Then show me who you really are." For a moment, Alexander seemed on the verge of completely losing control. His eyes traveled over her face, stopped at her parted lips, descended to the curve of her neck. Autumn could feel the tension radiating from him in almost tangible waves. Then, abruptly, he released her and backed away. "No, I won't lower myself to her level." Autumn felt the rejection like a physical slap. "This has nothing to do with your mother. This is about us." "There is no us, Autumn," Alexander said with a coldness she knew was fabricated. "There can never be. Before Autumn could respond, the sound of tires on the gravel road interrupted them. Alexander frowned. He wasn't expecting visitors, and the caretaker wasn't supposed to appear for a few more days. They walked to the front window and saw a black car with official plates parking near the gate. Two men in suits got out of the vehicle, and even from a distance Autumn could see they weren't social visits. "Damn," muttered Alexander. "Who are they?" "Federal agents, from the look of it." Alexander observed the men approaching the house. Someone must have made a report. Autumn felt her stomach contract. "About the studio. Silencing or about you? Or about us?" Alexander moved away from the window. "Autumn, I need you to listen to me now. Whatever they want, you don't know anything. You're just a restorer hired to work on the property." "Alexander, I won't lie to—" "You will do exactly what I'm telling you," he interrupted her, and there was authority in his voice that didn't admit discussion. "These people aren't here to deliver justice. They're here to protect secrets. And if you're not careful, you could become one of those secrets that need to be silenced." His tone made Autumn shiver. "What are you talking about?" Alexander held her face between his hands, forcing her to maintain eye contact. "I'm talking about the fact that some of the names on that list have enough power to make people disappear. And a young woman alone with no known family would be an easy target." Autumn felt genuine fear for the first time since she arrived at the property. "So what do we do?" "We don't do anything. I handle this. You stay quiet and let me deal with the situation." The doorbell rang, echoing through the empty house like a sinister omen. Alexander released her face and straightened his shirt, assuming the posture of the successful businessman who was accustomed to dealing with authorities. "Remember," he said softly before heading to the door, "you don't know anything." Autumn watched him open the door and greet the visitors with the cold courtesy she already knew well. The men introduced themselves as Agent Forrest and Agent Sullivan from the FBI, and said they were there to ask some routine questions about Margaret Harrison's death. "Of course," replied Alexander naturally, "though I don't understand what the FBI would have to do with the natural death of an 83-year-old woman." Agent Forrest smiled, but there was no warmth in the gesture. "Sometimes natural deaths reveal unnatural secrets, Mr. Harrison. May we come in?" Alexander stepped away from the door, allowing the men to enter. Autumn remained in the kitchen, but could hear the conversation perfectly. "We received an anonymous tip about irregular activities on this property," continued Agent Forrest. "Activities that would have occurred years ago, but that may have left evidence." "What kind of activities?" asked Alexander, and Autumn admired how his voice remained balanced. "Psychological abuse, possible influence peddling, blackmail." Agent Sullivan walked around the room, observing everything with experienced eyes. "Do you know anyone called Autumn Lane?" Autumn felt her heart stop. In the living room, Alexander didn't hesitate for even a second. "Yes, she's a restorer I hired to work on some pieces on the property." "Why?" "Because we believe she may not be who she claims to be," replied Agent Forrest, "and we would very much like to talk to her." Autumn took a deep breath and entered the living room, assuming the professional posture she had perfected over the years. "Good afternoon, I'm Autumn Lane. I heard you'd like to speak with me." Agent Forrest studied her with uncomfortable intensity, as if trying to decipher her. "Ms. Lane, how long have you known Mr. Harrison?" "Just a few days. I was hired to restore some artwork on the property." Autumn kept her voice firm, but Alexander noticed the tension in her shoulders. "And before that?" "You'd never had contact with the Harrison family." Autumn hesitated for a fraction of a second, and Alexander saw that she was deciding how much of the truth to reveal. "Not personally, no." Agent Sullivan approached her, deliberately invading her personal space. "Interesting, because we have information that you may have a more personal interest in this family." Alexander took a step forward, positioning himself partially between Autumn and the agent. "With all due respect, what is exactly the purpose of this visit?" "You mentioned a tip, but you still haven't explained what you're investigating." Agent Forrest smiled, and this time there was something predatory in the expression. "We're investigating allegations that Margaret Harrison kept compromising files on various prominent figures in American society. Files that could be used for blackmail." "And you think these files still exist?" Alexander asked, maintaining a casual tone. "We think certain people may be looking for them," replied Agent Sullivan, without taking his eyes off Autumn. People who perhaps have family motivations to want to expose old secrets. Autumn felt her blood freeze. They knew. Somehow they knew about her true identity and her motivations. I don't know what you're talking about. No? Agent Forrest took a tablet from his pocket and showed a series of photographs. Then can you explain to us why you were seen several times in recent months, visiting public archives, researching the Harrison family, asking questions about Clara Lane? Alexander observed the photographs with growing alarm. They were images of Autumn in different locations, county clerks' offices, libraries, museums, clearly investigating the connection between her mother and the Harrisons. Someone had been watching her for much longer than she imagined. I was doing research for my work, Autumn replied, but her voice sounded less confident now. Agent Sullivan laughed, a harsh and unpleasant sound. How interesting, because our records show that you were particularly interested in documents related to unregistered births from 1994. Very specific year, don't you think? Alexander felt the situation deteriorating rapidly. Look, I don't know what game you're playing, but this isn't a game, Mr. Harrison, Agent Forrest interrupted him. It's a matter of national security. The files your mother possibly kept contain sensitive information about people who still occupy strategic positions in the government. If those files fall into the wrong hands, you're not here to investigate, Autumn suddenly realized, her voice coming out louder than intended. You're here to cover up, to ensure that nothing is revealed. The two men exchanged glances, and Alexander saw something dangerous pass between them. Ms. Lane, you're getting involved in matters you don't understand. I understand perfectly, Autumn replied, finding her courage. I understand that you represent exactly the type of corruption that my mother suffered at the hands of Margaret Harrison. Alexander grabbed her arm, trying to silence her, but Autumn pulled away. My mother was blackmailed and forced into exile because she knew secrets that could compromise powerful people. And you're here to ensure the same thing happens to me. Agent Forrest sighed as if dealing with a stubborn child. Ms. Lane, or should I say Ms. Harrison. The name hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. Alexander felt all his protective instincts awaken at once. Get out of my property now. Not until we get what we came for, Agent Sullivan said. And Alexander noticed that he had placed his hand discreetly over something in his jacket, probably a gun. And what exactly did you come to get? Alexander asked, mentally calculating the distances to possible exits. Your mother's files, and the guarantee that certain information will never become public. Agent Forrest walked to the window that looked out toward the studio. We know you found the studio. We know there are documents there. And we know that Miss Harrison is planning to use them for some kind of public exposure. Autumn looked at Alexander, and he saw genuine fear in her eyes for the first time. Alexander, no, he said firmly, moving to protect her completely. Whatever you want, the answer is no. Agent Sullivan smiled, but it was a cold and calculating expression. Mr. Harrison, you're an intelligent businessman. Surely you understand that some information is too dangerous to exist. I understand that you're not real agents, sir, Alexander replied. Real agents don't make veiled threats on private property. Agent Forrest took a phone from his pocket. One call from me, Mr. Harrison, and Ms. Harrison can be charged with fraud, document falsification, property invasion, attempted extortion. She could spend the next 10 years in prison while lawyers battle for her innocence. Alexander felt anger rise like lava in his veins. And what do you want in exchange? Be simple. All the documents from the studio and a confidentiality agreement signed by Ms. Harrison guaranteeing her perpetual silence about any information related to the Harrison family or your mother's activities. Autumn stepped forward, and Alexander saw fierce determination in her eyes. And if I refuse? Then you'll have an accident, Agent Sullivan said casually. Rural roads can be dangerous, especially for young women driving alone at night. The explicit threat made something inside Alexander break completely. Years of rigid control, of business rationality, of forced civility disappeared in an instant. He moved with the speed of someone who had trained in martial arts in his youth, grabbing Agent Sullivan by the neck before the man could react. You just made a mistake, Alexander said, his voice low and dangerous. You just threatened the wrong person in front of the wrong person. Agent Forrest tried to intervene, but Autumn, acting on instinct, grabbed a heavy bronze candlestick from the side table and hit him on the head. The man staggered, stunned. "Alexander, let's get out of here," Autumn said urgently. Alexander released Agent Sullivan, who fell to the floor, coughing and holding his throat. "No, let's finish this once and for all." He went to a specific drawer in the study and removed a small digital recorder. "You think you came here to get compromising documents? Congratulations, you just created new ones." Alexander showed the device, which had been recording the entire conversation. Explicit threats to civilians, attempted suppression of evidence, abuse of power. "Do you think your bosses will like to hear this?" Agent Forrest recovered enough to speak, but his voice came out slurred. "You don't understand who you're messing with." "I understand perfectly," Alexander replied. "I'm messing with cowards who hide behind fake badges to protect secrets from decades ago." He approached the man, and Autumn saw something absolutely implacable in his eyes. "But you made two mistakes. First, you came to my house. Second, you threatened the woman I love." The words came out before Alexander could stop them, hanging in the air like a confession that changed everything. Autumn stared at him, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Get out of my property," Alexander continued, never taking his eyes off the men. "And tell your bosses that if anything happens to Autumn, to anyone related to this situation, I will use all the resources I have, and they are many, to expose not only my mother's secrets, but also all the rot in the system you represent." The two men recovered slowly, clearly reassessing the situation. What they had planned as simple intimidation had turned into something much more complicated. "This isn't over," muttered Agent Forrest as he headed toward the door. "Yes, it is," Autumn said, finding her own voice, "because you underestimated one fundamental thing." The men stopped, waiting. Autumn looked at Alexander, then back at them. "You underestimated the fact that some people are willing to fight for the truth, regardless of the personal cost." After the fake agents left, Alexander and Autumn stood in silence for long minutes, the weight of his confession hanging between them like something tangible. Alexander still held the recorder, but his eyes were fixed on Autumn, who stared at him with a mixture of love and desperation that broke his heart. "You said you love me," she finally murmured, her voice almost inaudible. Alexander closed his eyes, running his free hand through his hair. "That wasn't how I intended to—" "Truth or lie?" Autumn interrupted him, taking a step in his direction. "In this moment, after everything that just happened, I need to know. Truth or lie?" Alexander stared at her, and Autumn saw that all of his defenses had completely collapsed. "Truth," he said simply. "God help me, it's the truth." Autumn closed the distance between them, placing her hands on his chest. "Alexander, we need to talk about something I discovered yesterday in the studio, but didn't have the courage to tell you." Alexander frowned. "What else can there be?" Autumn took a deep breath, as if preparing to jump off a cliff. "I found more documents. Documents that your mother hid even from the other evidence." She walked to her bag and pulled out a folder that Alexander hadn't seen before. "DNA tests, Alexander. Your mother had secret tests done." Alexander felt the world spin again. "Tests of what?" "Versuchte paternity. Between you, your father, and—" Autumn paused, struggling with the words. "And me." Alexander took the folder with trembling hands. The documents were from a private laboratory in New York, dated just 2 years ago. Margaret had obtained samples, how Alexander didn't even want to imagine, and had ordered comparative tests. "I don't understand," he murmured, leafing through the papers. "Why would she do this?" "Read the last document," Autumn said softly. Alexander found the final sheet, an official medical report. His eyes scanned the technical text until they reached the conclusion that made him sit heavily in the nearest armchair. "Exclusion of paternity," he read aloud. "Joseph Harrison cannot be the biological father of Autumn Lane Harrison with 99.9% certainty." The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander read the document 3 times before he could fully process the information. "We're not siblings," said Autumn, tears streaming down her face. "We never were." Alexander raised his face to look at her. "But Clara—" "The letters, everything. Clara was pregnant when she met your father. The child she was carrying already existed." Autumn approached him again. "Margaret discovered this, and used the information as additional blackmail. Not only did she threaten to expose the affair, but also to spread lies about paternity, to completely destroy Clara's reputation. Alexander felt a mixture of overwhelming relief and renewed anger. So my mother ruined an innocent woman's life, separated two lovers, and left you to grow up believing you were a rejected, illegitimate child. But that means there's nothing preventing us from... Autumn couldn't finish the sentence, her emotion completely overwhelming her. Alexander stood up and pulled her into his arms, finally allowing himself to feel what he had denied since the moment he saw her. The kiss that followed was desperate, loaded with weeks of repressed tension and the liberation from a guilt that had tormented them. When they separated, both were breathless. "Autumn," Alexander murmured against her forehead, "I love you, and I won't let anything separate us. Not fake agents, not secrets from the past, not fear of the future." "What do we do now?" she asked, nestling in his arms as if she wanted to merge with him. Alexander looked out the window toward the studio, then at the documents scattered across the table. "We deliver justice, but the right way." In the days that followed, Alexander and Autumn worked together to organize all the evidence. Using his contacts in the business and legal world, Alexander found trustworthy investigative journalists and lawyers specializing in human rights. Instead of a sensationalist exposure, they created a meticulous dossier that would be delivered to the competent authorities, the real authorities, not the corrupt lackeys who had threatened them. "Some of the women are still alive," Autumn said one night, as they catalogued the last documents. "I managed to locate 3 of them through public records." Alexander watched her work, admiring the determination with which she had embraced the cause. "And are they willing to speak?" "One of them is. Karen Wilson. She's 60 now, a retired doctor. She said she spent decades trying to overcome what your mother did to her here." Autumn raised her eyes from the papers. "She wants Margaret to be exposed, even posthumously. She wants other families to know what happened so it never happens again." Alexander approached her, gently massaging her tense shoulders. "And you? Are you prepared for all the media attention this will bring?" Autumn covered one of his hands with hers. "I'm prepared for anything as long as we're together." The story was published 3 months later in a series of investigative reports that shook the country. The exposure of Margaret Harrison's activities led to the opening of investigations into various public figures, some of whom resigned from their positions. More importantly, it established a legal precedent for victims of systematic psychological abuse. Alexander and Autumn faced public scrutiny together. There were speculations about their relationship, invasive questions about their motivations, attempts to discredit their evidence, but they remained united, supporting each other through each media storm. "No regrets?" Asked a journalist during a press conference 6 months after the initial publication. Alexander held Autumn's hand, and she felt his strength flowing through the contact. "Never. Difficult truths need to be told. And some fights are worth any personal cost." Autumn smiled, squeezing his hand. "Besides, we discovered that when you face the darkness of the past, you can find light in the future." A year later, Alexander and Autumn married in a simple ceremony in Charlottesville, Virginia. The Willow Creek estate had been transformed into a support center for victims of psychological abuse, funded by the Harrison Fortune and administered by a foundation that bore the name of Clara Lane. The studio, where everything had begun, became an art therapy space. Clara's paintings were restored and exhibited, not as evidence of a scandal, but as testimonies to the strength and beauty that can emerge even from the most difficult circumstances. On their wedding night, Alexander and Autumn walked through the estate's gardens, now carefully restored. The property that had once been the scene of suffering and manipulation had become a symbol of healing and rebirth. "Do you think your mother would have been proud?" Alexander asked, embracing Autumn as they observed the stars above the old property. Autumn thought about the woman she had never known personally, but whose spirit she had felt in every brushstroke of the works in the studio. "I think she would be happy knowing that her daughter found not only the truth she was looking for, but also the love that she herself was forced to abandon." Alexander kissed the top of her head. "And you? Did you find what you were looking for?" Autumn turned in his arms, looking into the eyes of the man who had started as a stranger, became a supposed brother, revealed himself as an enemy of the injustices of the past, and finally transformed into the love of her life. "I found more than I was looking for," she said, sealing the answer with a kiss. "I found you. I found my family. I found my purpose. And I found proof that some stories, no matter how dark they begin, can have luminous endings." Above them, the main house rose against the starry sky, its windows now shining with warm light instead of the cold shadows of the past. The wind carried the scent of jasmine that autumn had planted to replace Margaret's wild roses, and somewhere on the property, the sound of soft music emanated from the piano that had witnessed both secrets and revelations. Alexander and Autumn had transformed a property of secrets into a home of truths. They had converted a legacy of manipulation into a future of healing. And they had proved that true love, when tested by the greatest obstacles, doesn't just survive, it thrives, creating something more beautiful than either lover could have imagined alone.